Welcome to today's presentation about the Cold War. Please remember to pause this video as necessary in order for you to complete the accompanying notes. Let's start with a definition of what the Cold War is. It is the state of tension without actual fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union, which divided the world into two camps. The reason it's called cold is because there is not actual fighting between the US and the Soviet Union. It is just a tense situation which could have erupted into actual fighting, but because there was not actual fighting, it's called a Cold War. The whole world divides itself into two categories. They're either siding with the United States or siding with the Soviet Union. This lesson is going to be specifically about how the end of World War II led directly to the start of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Let's start with the division of Germany. Germany was divided into two countries. East Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union, and West Germany was controlled by the United States, Great Britain, and France. If you remember from World War II, the Soviet Union, the US, Great Britain, and France make up the Allied powers, and they are the victors in this war by defeating Germany. So they take control of the country and divide it up. They also divide up the capital city of Berlin into West Berlin, controlled by the US, France, Great Britain, and East Berlin, controlled by the Soviet Union. However, Berlin is located firmly in East Germany, in a central location there. So it is completely surrounded by Soviet control. So West Berlin, even though controlled by the US and its allies, is surrounded by Soviet Union. Winston Churchill, the leader of Great Britain, gives a famous quote at this time, that an iron curtain now separates Eastern and Western Europe. He is speaking figuratively here about Stalin cutting off contact between Eastern and Western Europe. The United Nations is also a result of World War II. The United Nations was created in 1945 with the goal of preventing future wars. It is based off of Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations that came into existence after World War I that had the same goal. However, the League fails and disbands when it fails to prevent World War II. It is an association of many nations in the world who meet in New York City. It's made up of two parts, the General Assembly, in which every member nation has a representative, and the Security Council. The Security Council has a few permanent members, and this is where many important decisions are made. The permanent members include the United States, England, France, Russia, and China, and it also has several other slots that countries rotate on and off after a certain period of time. The United Nations is still in existence in 2014. The Marshall Plan is money given to help Europe's economy recover. European economies were devastated after World War II. Remember, most of the fighting took place in Europe and in the Pacific, and so those countries suffered extensive damage to their infrastructure, such as factories, roads, and things like that, and they need help recovering. The United States feared Stalin's influence and spread of communism by the Soviet Union, so they wanted to jump in and help Europe recover so that they could be allied with Western Europe and not the Soviet Union. The Marshall Plan called for the United States to lend $13 billion to help the European economy recover.
In 1947, the British announced that they could no longer afford to support the pro-Western governments of the Mediterranean in their fight against communism. If the U.S. could not take up the burden, the whole region was in danger of falling under communist rule. The Truman administration responded decisively. On March 12, 1947, the president went before a joint session of Congress to request aid for the countries of Greece and Turkey. The address sent a clear message to the Soviet Union.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
The president's appeal was quickly dubbed the Truman Doctrine. It represented a dramatic change in U.S. foreign policy, but it merely laid the groundwork for what followed. A month later, Secretary of State George C. Marshall traveled to Europe. He witnessed firsthand the physical ruin, social disintegration, and economic collapse left by the war. Marshall warned that under these conditions, Europeans would turn to communism as an alternative to starvation and death. 2 months later, Marshall proposed a program of massive economic assistance, the Marshall Plan.
Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world, so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist.
European reaction to Marshall's speech was quick and positive. The British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin hailed it as a lifeline to sinking men. Of all the nations invited to help draft the plan, only the Soviet Union and its satellites refused. The price would be high, up to $17 billion, but compared to the alternative, Marshall told Congress it was a bargain.
This program should be viewed as an investment in peace. In those terms, the cost is low.
While Congress debated the enormous financial commitment, communist-inspired riots led to the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Czechoslovakia. The events galvanized opinion on Capitol Hill, and Congress approved funding for the Marshall Plan. American aid was soon on its way to Europe. Food was distributed, machinery and technical support spurred new production. Homes and businesses were rebuilt. Marshall Plan aid provided nets for Flemish fishermen, money to rebuild Italian automotive factories, construction equipment for France, and coal to fuel Danish industry. The Marshall Plan was an overwhelming success. It launched Western Europe on the road to recovery, beat back the threat of communism in the region, and established the United States as the world's dominant economic superpower. It also contributed to the first major confrontation of the Cold War.
Please pause the video here for a few moments in order to complete this cartoon analysis about the Marshall Plan. The next section of this lesson will be about early tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Pictured here we have Harry Truman, President of the United States, and helping out Western Europe. Western Europe and the U.S. both have democratic systems of government, meaning that all citizens have a say in their leaders. They are capitalist, which means they have a free market enterprise. The government does not control the economy. And they controlled West Germany. In contrast, on the right, we have the Soviet Union, leader Joseph Stalin, and Eastern Europe. These groups of nations are dictatorial. They have a dictator in charge, which means the citizens do not have a say in government. They are communist, meaning the government controls the economy, in contrast to capitalist, which means the private companies are controlling the economy. And they controlled East Germany. Further contrasting, the United States and Western Europe developed NATO. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This group is a military alliance formed to stop the spread of communism. Members are the United States, England, France, and West Germany, among other smaller countries. Their policy is that of containment. Their goal is to contain communism where it already exists in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and not let it spread any further. I like to think of it as a travel mug full of coffee. If my travel mug does what it's supposed to do, it contains my coffee. My coffee won't spread anywhere. Think of the coffee as communism. If my travel mug breaks, my coffee is going to spread all over my desk and everywhere else. And that's exactly what NATO wants to prevent. They don't want communism to be like the coffee in my broken mug and spreading all over the world. The Soviet Union and Eastern Europe decide to form the Warsaw Pact as a response to NATO. Members are the Soviet Union, Poland, and East Germany, among other countries. Their policy is to spread communism around the world. So as you can see, the United States and Western Europe are pretty much the opposite of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and these two opposite ideologies are the foundations of the Cold War. Now, these differences lead to competition between the two superpowers. Superpowers means very strong countries. Competition includes the atomic arms race, referring to the atomic bomb. The United States has it, if you remember, and used it in World War II. So the Soviet Union is working very hard to develop it to catch up with the United States. The Berlin airlift is a second conflict between the two superpowers, and I will show you a video on that in a moment. And the third conflict is going to be the space race. Who is going to be able to get to outer space first? And one of your extension activities will have to do with looking into the space race first. In the 1960s, who's going to get out in orbit? Is it going to be the Soviet Union? Is it going to be the US? And who's going to get to the moon first? Is it going to be the Soviets or is it going to be the Americans? Here's a video explaining in further detail the Berlin airlift.
Finally tonight, our person of the week. Whenever Americans get a warm reception in Berlin, whether it's President Kennedy, President Reagan, or presidential hopeful Barack Obama, they owe a debt of gratitude to an American pilot who started doing something 60 years ago this week that won the heart of that city in its darkest hour.
We had freedom, we had flour, they had to have both.
It was July 1948, 3 years after the end of World War II, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was making a grab for Eastern Europe.
West Berlin, an island of freedom in the Red Sea, was in his way.
Berlin stood divided between East and West, so the Soviets cut off land supply lines to the 2.25 million West Berliners. The Allies decided on an airlift. American pilots began flying tons of flour, milk, meat, even coal to desperate Berliners. And 27-year-old Hal Halverson was one of those pilots. He noticed children standing behind barbed wire at the end of the runway. These are his own home movies.
And then I realized suddenly that not one of those 30 kids had put out their hand and said, "You got any chocolate?"
He gave the kids a stick of gum.
But these kids were so grateful, I had to do something.
Al didn't ask anyone's permission. He then started fashioning tiny parachutes out of handkerchiefs and tied candy to each one. But he had to get the attention of the children on the ground below.
I'll wiggle the wings of that big airplane.
Those wing wiggles became Hal's trademark. He dropped dozens of tiny parachutes, and grateful German children spread the word about their former enemies, the Americans, and what they were doing.
They fell in love with America, and they went home and convinced their parents.
And the candy bar, that was a symbol of hope.
The military brass had no clue who the candy bomber was.
There in base op was a big stack of mail. And on the letters it said, "To Uncle Wiggly Wings."
But a reporter had seen Hal land and got his tail number. The candy bomber was about to get busted.
Thought I was going to be court-martialed.
He was called up before a colonel.
He said, "General Tyner thinks it's a good idea. Keep doing it, but keep me informed."
Then other pilots joined in, and the candy bombing went on until the airlift ended in 1949. Americans from home were sending lots of candy and handkerchiefs.
The work
We see today is in many ways a testament to what Hal Halverson did. Berlin would not have been able to survive through that terrible winter of 1948 were it not for the spirit of the people of Berlin.
the hitting balm on the wounds of war is what the airlift was, because they were so grateful, like the kids. The gratitude breaks down the walls between people when one's grateful.
Please complete this cartoon analysis and pause the video about this cartoon and the Iron Curtain and the division of Eastern and Western Europe. Next, take a moment to fill in this Venn diagram, going back through your notes and finding differences and similarities between capitalism and communism. You must have 3 things in each section. You have finished the video lesson. Please take the exit quiz and then complete one of the following extension activities.